Welcome to this month's Creation Justice webinar, a gathering place for building a faith-rooted and faith-sustained movement addressing some of the most pressing issues facing our world today. I'm Brooks Barrett, the Environmental Justice Minister for the United Church of Christ, and I am joined by the one and only, the Reverend Michael Malcolm, the Executive Director for the People's Justice Council and Alabama Interfaith Power and Light. Michael, we are talking about life everlasting, not of the soul, but of plastic, because it never seems to die. And it's precisely because of this quality that some say plastic doesn't have a life cycle, it has a death spiral. What are your thoughts today? Because this is truly a matter of life and death that goes beyond plastic itself. It relates to public health and our environment and things that impact us daily. So I'm curious to get your thoughts as we get started today, Michael.
Yeah, I concur that it is a matter of life and death. It's also a matter of death in that plastics harm and appears to be eternal. It's also a challenge for those of us who acknowledge this. It's a challenge for us to be good stewards of creation and created. In essence, the individual decisions that we make with our use of plastics regulates the demand for plastics. Not only do plastics harm our collective home, it harms our collective humanity. Plastic manufacturing plants are often located in communities that look and live like me. Ignoring the plight of the people living in those communities in order to enjoy the comforts that these plastics brings harm us collectively as humanity. This issue calls for our collective attention. Those of us who care should answer that call collectively. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for orienting us towards that call to action and that collective work that we are engaged in together. Let me now introduce our speaker for today. Derrick Weston is the Theological Training and Education Coordinator for Creation Justice Ministries. He is the co-host for the Food and Faith podcast, as well as the producer of Spoon, Spade, and Soul, a podcast highlighting food and land-based ministries in the Episcopal Church. Additionally, he is the producer of the short film series, A Wilderness Like Eden, highlighting the ministries of churches engaged in food justice. Derrick is additionally the co-author of the book, The Just Kitchen, Invitations to Sustainability, Cooking, Connection, and Celebration. We are delighted to have you with us today, Derrick, to talk about a new resource from Creation Justice Ministries that can be used for Earth Sunday or really any Sunday. It's really a terrific resource and it's free. So we'll let you take it away from here, Derrick.
Thank you, Brooks. Thank you, Reverend Malcolm. It's good to be with you all. Good to be with all of you here today. As Brooks mentioned, I am the Theological Education and Training Coordinator for Creation Justice Ministries. We are an ecumenical ministry, and our mission is to help Christians to live in right relationship with God's good creation. And that's from individual Christians to churches to denominations. And I'm excited to talk to you about our Earth Day resource. Every year, the Board of Creation Justice Ministries, of which Brooks is a part, gets together and thinks about what is a theme for Earth Day that we want to put forward in front of the church. And actually, I think Brooks was one of the folks who led the charge, recognizing some of the good work that has happened in the UCC around pointing our attention towards plastics and the devastating effect that plastics have on our world, on our own personal health. And the introduction that both Brooks and Reverend Malcolm gave kind of gives us a good overview of some of what we're going to talk about in the resource. And I'm just really excited that we have the opportunity to share this with you. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I'm going to walk you through a little bit of what we've been thinking about as we talk about this issue. So, Earth Day Sunday, our annual Earth Day resource, Earth Day Sunday, is Plastic Jesus: Real Faith in a Synthetic World. And as we came up with this theme, the question emerged almost immediately: why should we care about plastics? So let's do a little bit of history. I'm going to try to go through the first part of this fairly quickly so that we can talk a little bit more about the ways that the church can respond. But let's talk about the history of plastic. It was first produced in 1907. So again, we have to recognize that so many of the things that we take as normal have really only been a part of human history for less than 100 years. It's only produced at a global scale since the 1950s. And since then, annual plastic production has increased nearly 230-fold to 460 million tons in 2019. The dangers of plastic: it damages habitats. It interrupts natural processes, and that's on all levels, whether that's thinking about photosynthesis, whether that's thinking about decomposition, whether that's thinking about digestion of all kinds. Plastic interrupts those natural processes. It reduces the ability of ecosystems to adapt to climate change. It negatively affects millions of people's livelihoods, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. It disrupts food production capabilities, and it's harmful to our social well-being. Our waterways are especially susceptible to pollution, which disrupts commercial and recreational fishing. I think all of us have seen pictures of fish that are, whether it's in a six-pack ring, or sea life that has sea turtles that have plastic straws lodged in them somewhere. We've seen the videos. If you're a person who's kind of a nature video geek like I am, you've probably seen the videos where they have opened up the bellies of sea creatures and had plastics pour out of them. Ocean life is incredibly susceptible to the disruptions that plastics cause. Leads to infections. It inhibits their ability to swim. Can create all kinds of internal injuries and death. And again, they get passed down the food chain. Plastic waste inputs from land into the ocean in 2010. And again, we can only extrapolate these numbers going forward to our time. The 192 countries with a coast bordering the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans, Mediterranean, Black Seas, produced a total of 2.5 billion metric tons of solid waste. And of that, 275 million metric tons was plastic. An estimated 8 million metric tons of mismanaged plastic waste entered the ocean in 2010. And again, without mitigation, those numbers have continued, and in some places, those numbers have increased. One of the things that we have to understand when we think about plastics, so it's easy again to imagine that plastic ring around the fish, but we have to understand that plastic doesn't biodegrade, it breaks down. And so when plastic breaks down, it can get into forms like nanoplastics and microplastics, which are easily consumable by the smallest of creatures. They can be eaten by bacteria and plankton. The filtering animals, for those of us who are near water, the oysters and shellfish that do a lot of the cleaning of our bays and shores, they're consuming these plastics. Often not in the big pieces that we imagine, but in these little particles of nanoplastics and microplastics. And they work their way up the food chain. They work their way up to fish, to birds, to turtles, to marine mammals, and then to the top predators, including us. Every week we eat, you and I, we eat roughly a credit card worth of microplastics. This is a human health crisis. And if you take a look at this chart, you see the levels of microplastics that are found in various places. Bottled water is a huge source of microplastics. Beer, tap water, seafood, sugar, salt, honey. And, of course, honey is a thing that we would think wouldn't have something like microplastics in it. And yet honey is one of these sources. And of course, the air itself, because as these plastics break down, they are blown around through the atmosphere. The chemicals found in microplastics cause significant health problems, which are felt disproportionately by people of color and low-income communities. And this is part of what we have to understand, that these particles, these particulates, are found more often in spaces where waste is disposed. And as many of you know, you're far more likely to be exposed to waste if you are a person of color or a low-income person. One of the examples is, as Reverend Malcolm brought up, the productions of plastics. It's not just the plastics themselves, it is the processes that produce them. The industrial corridor along the lower Mississippi, Cancer Alley, is about 85 miles stretched between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. And there's over 200 high polluting industrial facilities there. This is a disproportionately Black community, and it has the highest rates of cancer in the country. And it's not a coincidence. There is actual correlation here that can be proven of the exposure that people who are living in Cancer Alley and the health outcomes that are a result. Cancer, all kinds of cancers, by the way, organ malfunctions, impaired sensory organs, eyes, skin, birth defects, all of these things are a byproduct of the production, the actual production of these plastics, which happens more readily in already vulnerable communities. Let's talk about recycling, because many of us were raised to believe that the obvious answer to this question was that we recycle. Plastics take 20 to 500 years to decompose. Under 14% of plastic packaging is recycled. Take those two things even in and of themselves, you're talking about plastic being around for a very long time. And much of that plastic is staying in the ecosystem. It's difficult to recycle different plastics together since they melt differently, and it's expensive. All of you know that there are different there's a number system, different numbers of plastics, they melt differently, and so they have to be sorted variously. Some municipalities will only collect certain numbers. Some will only, and that has actually become more limiting of people having the opportunities to recycle. And then the question is, who do you think is the world's single largest producer of single-use plastic waste? And the issue that we need to understand is that as we as a culture are beginning to shift to more electrified vehicles and more solar and wind-based energies, cleaner energy sources, all of which these are good things. But as we make that pivot as a society, the fossil fuel companies are making a shift as well. Their shift is to more production of single-use plastic. They see single-use plastic as the future for them. that this is going to be where their resources go as people stop using fossil fuels so much for energy, fuel, heating, etc. So all of the largest producers of the single-use plastic waste that we're talking about, they are the usual suspects of the fossil fuel companies. And here's the other piece about recycling. We talked a little bit about the fact that there's only a limited number of things that are actually getting to be recycled. But the fact of the matter is that plastic recycling, very little of even those things that are making it into the system are actually being recycled. That much of it is going back into landfills, and it's often been the folks who are creating these plastics that have funded the campaigns and the PR that has told us that recycling is the way to handle these problems. Because the bottom line is that these companies have known for decades that recycling wasn't going to be the answer, that virtually no plastic can be recycled, that we can't recycle our way out of this issue. We can't recycle ourselves into a place where we're going to have less in our system. We're going to have less in our ecosystems. We haven't been able to do it. It's always sort of been a no-win situation for us. So then what does that mean for the church? And I think that's ultimately where we in this conversation, having all of these facts behind us, what does God ask of us as God's people? What is the faithful response to this situation? So one of the things that we were challenged to do as the resource committee of Creation Justice Ministries and myself worked together on this resource, we were challenged to think theologically about plastic. And how do you think theologically about something of which the Bible does not speak? Because while plastic is seemingly everywhere in our world, it's not in the Bible. But there are some very ancient, time-tested theological ideas that do help us think about how we address this issue as the church. First is sin, and thinking about sin not as just the individual acts that harm others and that hurt God's heart, but thinking of sin as corporate. Recognizing that so often when the Bible speaks of sin, the Bible speaks of corporate sin, it speaks of the sin of communities. It speaks of the sin, particularly of the ways that those in charge have led the people astray. And that is one of the things that I think is really crucial for us in talking about the plastic situation, is that this is a sin. The ways in which we have degraded our ecosystem with plastics is sinful. The ways in which we have let profits, profits, get in the way of human health is sin. The ways in which we have let our non-human kin be harmed by plastics is sin. And we have to name that. And we have to use that theological language. That theological language is actually of benefit to us. And we need to recognize that. We need to recognize idolatry. And I love this definition that comes from Wendell Berry. Idolatry always reduces to worship of something made with human hands, something confined with the terms of human work and human comprehension. So much of what we have been sold as a bill of goods about plastics is how much it's making things more convenient and how much it's making things better, and how much we're able to improve our environments by creating things from plastics. That's an idolatrous attitude. That is an idolatrous way of looking at the world. Recognizing that we have put what we have made, oftentimes in the place of God's creation, calling it better, calling it superior in some ways to the bounty that the world has given us, the bounty that God has given us through creation. Recognizing that theologically is spelled wrong here. Sorry about that. One of the other pieces that, as we think about how do we talk about this issue theologically, one of the things that we begin to recognize, as particularly if we're doing any kind of creation justice work, is recognizing that God has called us to live within limits. God has called us to have boundaries, and that it's good for us to know our limits, and it's good for us to not extend ourselves beyond our limits. And another way of saying this is recognizing the good gift of enough. So often we hear Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And yet we fail to look at this as we often do with lots of Bible verses that we isolate. We fail to look at it in context. Paul says this: "For I have learned to be content with whatever I have. I know what it is to have little, and I know what it is to have plenty. In any and all circumstances, I have learned the secret of being well fed and of going hungry, of having plenty and of being in need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me." In other words, what Paul is saying, this superhuman gift that he has through Christ, is the gift of contentment. Learning to be content with what we have, not always seeking the new, seeking the best, seeking the improved, seeking the surplus. Recognizing that we have what we need, that creation has given us what we need, and that if we can reorient ourselves to live within limits, the limits that creation gives to us, that we can have a healthier world. So part of this resource has been creating prayer and worship resources, because if we are going to have these conversations, most of us know that if we're going to, that unless we center things in worship, they become sort of an add-on to the life of the church. They become sort of a second tier priority. And so we have to figure out ways to integrate these messages into our worship. So we have one of the things that is incredibly important for us at Creation Justice Ministries is preaching. Preaching is a powerful tool. Excuse me. Preaching is a powerful tool. And so thinking about how do we preach on these subjects? And so we want to give just some ideas of ways to think about this from a scriptural standpoint. And just to get the juices flowing, absolutely feel free to use any of these sermon starters, but hopefully they give you more of a way of thinking theologically and homiletically about this issue. One of the first texts that came to our mind as we thought about this was the story of the golden calf. And we all know the story of Moses going to the mountain to be with God, going up the mountain to be with God, the people getting impatient, and Aaron says to them to take the gold that they have, and he melts it down, and he took the gold from them, formed it into a mold, and cast an image of a calf. And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." And again, I think one of the ways that we draw the connection here is that we have made an idol of the things that we are capable of creating with human hands. We have made an idol of the things that we are able to make. And instead of thinking about whether or not they honor God and honor God's creation, we've just reveled in the fact that we can make these things instead of thinking about what is their impact on the community that surrounds us. So that's one way of thinking about this from a biblical standpoint. Another kind of connected to this idea, we talked about Philippians 4, but thinking about Psalm 23, this well-worn passage. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. What does it mean for us to not want? And what does it mean particularly that the not wanting in this particular passage is in the context of being in nature, of being in green pastures, of being beside still water? That's something about reconnecting ourselves to God's creation actually reduces that amount of want, that amount of needing to consume, of needing to purchase. And so what does it mean for us to not want? And what does it mean for us to preach about things like greed and overconsumption from the pulpit? Things that we sadly don't hear enough about in a lot of our churches. And then one of our board members wrote this theological reflection, which I think is absolutely brilliant, referencing the Tower of Babel. The story, again, another story that we know so well, where the people get together and say, "Come, let us make oven-fired bricks." They use brick for stone and asphalt for mortar. They said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city, a tower with its tops in the sky, and let us make a name for ourselves." And again, I think that's both a reflection of us as consumers, of being in awe of our scientific achievements, but also thinking about these fossil fuel companies who have known, again, for decades what they're doing, and so often are the ones who are leading the charge for us to reduce the harm that they are creating, putting the onus on us as consumers instead of recognizing the damage that they are doing and taking any responsibility for themselves. Let us make a name for ourselves. So in addition to the sermon starters, we also have prayers that are based off of a lot of these scriptures, things that you can use in the context of your worship services, whether that's Earth Sunday or any Sunday that you decide that you want to have these conversations in your congregation. We also, I want to encourage you to, as you explore this resource, go to Creation Justice Ministries YouTube channel. One of the things that we did in creating this resource was we had a songwriting retreat. Again, because plastic's not in the Bible, there's not a whole lot of hymns and songs written about plastic. So we got a group of 6 songwriters to sit around for a couple days, and they commissioned 3 songs for us. 3 original songs that, again, you are completely free to use, that speak to the theological concepts that we're talking about in the resource. So I don't know if we'll have time maybe later to play one of them, but just would really encourage you, if you have time, to go to Creation Justice Ministries YouTube station. You can find these 3 songs, which are called, one is called Plastic Jesus, named after the resource. One is called Creation is Waiting for Us. and the third is called Fall in Love with the Earth. So would encourage you to go to Creation Justice Ministries um, YouTube channel, and you'll also be able to find in the resource, you'll also be able to find sheet music for musicians in your church to be able to perform these songs in your church. None of this would mean anything, though, if it didn't lead us to some sorts of actions, to being able to find actions that we can take within our communities. So thinking very practically about what are steps that you can take to reduce plastic waste in your church. What does it mean to maybe get rid of those little plastic communion cups? What does it mean to get rid of plastics when we're having plastic dinnerware, when we're having our potlucks or gatherings or things of that nature? What are the small practical steps that we can take as churches? But then thinking about what does it mean for us to take bigger legislative action? Thinking about where do we insert ourselves as the voice of people of faith into any of these processes? And frankly, in all of these spaces, the voices of people of faith are required. That we can be talking to our legislators and our lawmakers about ways that we are reducing our plastic usage, but also ways that we are putting the burden onto the producers of these plastics to be more accountable for what they've done. The ways that we can be talking about ways that we can be better consumers, and ways that we can dispose and clean up more responsibly. We should be learning the research. We should be, familiarizing ourselves with some of the science so that we can, not that we should be turning our congregations into science lecture halls, but we should be conversant on some of the science so that we have some facts to back up our advocacy. And again, thinking about waste management, thinking about ways that we are a part of, thinking about the ways these things do have eternal life in our world, and what does it mean to mitigate what that eternal life might look like for human health and the health of our ecosystems. So maybe some things to think about for personal actions: doing a plastic-free Lenten series, reducing shellfish consumption, and educating yourself on your personal plastic use. And the shellfish consumption particularly is about, again, that a lot of, for better or for worse, a lot of those shellfish end up being feeders that get the plastics out of the system. It can be helpful to have them in our bays and in our coasts doing the work that we actually can't do. But educate yourself on your personal plastic use. One of the hard things for me as we were working on this resource was really taking stock of my own plastic use and really seeing how much single-use plastic is in my life and thinking about what are the ways that I can cut down on these things. It was pretty eye-opening when I actually found myself paying attention in a very focused way on my single-use plastics. Community actions: reduce the amount of single-use plastics you use for community meals. Do a community cleanup in your neighborhood or public spaces. Donate to support communities impacted by pollution. Advocate for your denomination or communion to completely divest from fossil fuel and petroleum companies. Knowing the good work that your denomination has done on some of these things is really important, because your denomination has been a leader in taking social action. Thinking about advocacy internationally, advocate for the U.S. government to sign on to the UN Environment Assembly resolution to end plastic pollution and create the world's first global plastic pollution treaty by 2024. This agreement would address the full life cycle of plastic from its production to its disposal and have significant implications for the economies of major plastic producing countries. And we are often one of the countries that drags our feet on signing on to a lot of these international treaties around the environment, because we have powerful corporate lobbyists who are keeping us out of them, who don't want us to sign on to these things. So it's important that we voice that there is a faith-based contingent that cares about these things. Engage your state and local government to seek bans on plastic bags. I'm in Maryland. We've really cracked down on plastic bag use. A lot of states are, and I think it's becoming more of a movement. I think people are adjusting. People are learning to bring their own bags. It's not that much of an inconvenience. We're learning that these things can be done, and that they can have large effects. And contact your local representatives and ask what actions they plan to take to address plastic pollution. We have to act. We have to act locally, and oftentimes our voices can be heard most effectively in our state and local governments. Then write a letter to your Congresspeople to support the Reduce Act. The Reduce Act rewarding efforts to decrease unrecycled contaminants in ecosystems. This is a sample letter that our staff has written. You can use this either individually or as a congregation, or in any jurisdictional bodies that you all have. Please feel free to adapt this, spread it widely, so that people in Congress know that we care about removing plastic from our ecosystems. And part of the Reduce Act is it imposes a tax on new plastic being manufactured and creates a fund that would use the money from the plastic tax to fund plastic waste reduction activities and exempt certain products and small businesses. So this is the end of our presentation. This is some of our staff who worked diligently on putting this piece together, along with our board and our resource committee. I would also say another piece that exists on our resources list, and you can find it on our website, is a wonderful interview that I had with Rob Grable and Bob Shore-Goss about the work that was done in the UCC. It's about a 40-minute interview that we did together. We kind of cut it down to be like a podcast that you can listen to. It was a really fun interview, and Rob and Bob, I think I saw Rob signed on here. So Rob, thank you for being a part of that. And but it was a great interview, and I learned a lot personally about the ways that your denomination has been a leader in moving the church forward on a lot of these conversations.
Got time for some questions for you, Derrick. And I want to lift up one that was put into our chat space here. If we're continuing to kind of preach kind of a reformist theology where we point to our personal and collective sin aimed at congregations that already feel powerless, Jesus spends all his time telling people they're forgiven. When do we pick up our collective soul force and go at the principalities and powers? That's a comment in the chat. What do you think there, Derrick?
That's a great, such a great comment and question and way of phrasing it. Everything about that was beautiful. You're absolutely right that there are so many in our congregations, and I would say particularly for those of us in mainline denominations, I'm Presbyterian, who have been on the front lines of some of this work forever, and a lot of it has been with people who feel the responsibility and who feel the guilt, and oftentimes are weighed down by that guilt. And again, I think that the extreme irony of this is that it is that guilt has come from the very people who are at the heart of the problem. And so you're absolutely right, that we have to, for those churches that have been in this fight for a long time, there absolutely has to be the full redemptive arc, right? That their sins are known, that their sins are forgiven, and that they are loved just where they are. That there has to be grace because the deck is stacked against them. The deck is stacked against any of us living in the Western world in the 21st century, trying to live a plastic-free existence. The game is rigged. And so, yes, we need to figure out ways that we mobilize those folks who have been, who have taken personal responsibility and push them towards collective action, push them towards what are the things that they can be doing in groups that move us towards addressing the fossil fuel companies. Thinking about all the ways that we can divest, thinking of all the spaces in which we can divest from, and that can mean some very personal things about where our personal investments and 401ks are located, about who we bank with, like really saying that if we're going to have any impact with these principalities and powers, we have to hit them where they live. We have to like really say, put our money where our mouth is, and say we're not going to continue to be a part of this cycle. But you're absolutely right. There has to be grace. There has to be grace for those of us recognizing that absolutely the game is rigged. The deck is stacked against us, and we need to like not point our fingers at each other, but really look at the systems that are allowing this to happen.
Thanks, Derrick, for that response. To kind of play off of a question in the chat or a comment made in the chat, someone made a point about kind of the greenwashing that's out there, things that are put out there as being improvements, whether we're talking about laundry sheets or small pods in the dishwasher, plasticized paper plates. How do we kind of discern what's, legitimate improvements and what's greenwashing?
Yeah, that is one of the hardest things about our culture right now, because we have made ecologically friendly into a marketing piece. It's become an advertising, it's become a slogan almost. One of the things that, as I'm thinking about, the things that I produce, is kind of thinking about the source and thinking about ways that I can track back to where is this product actually coming from. And so if a product has all of this eco-friendly language on it, but I track it back to a company who's heavily invested in fossil fuel industry, I track it back to a company that's deeply connected to plastics or even like big agriculture, then I'm suspicious. Then I'm suspicious of what their motives are. And we really do need to be discerning in those spaces, that sometimes we have to search a little harder for the folks who are genuinely concerned for the care of our planet, and sometimes we have to pay a little bit more, because there's smaller companies that can't afford to give us things at discounts. But and the other piece of that is shopping, not just for food, but for a lot of our products, being able to shop for them as locally as possible and be able to shop for them in a way where they've traveled a shorter distance, that usually means that there's been less processing involved. And therefore have had less influence by some of these petrol companies. But none of this is easy, and all of this requires that we educate ourselves, and that we do a little bit of digging, that we become educated consumers. And that can be, there's some deep rabbit holes out there. I know it. But we have to do the due diligence to like really think about, the other piece of this, is we have to name the greenwashing. Like, when we know that there is a company who is intentionally greenwashing, we need to put that out in all of the places that we can, all of the circles of influence that we can, because we need to inform each other. When we see the greenwashing happen, we need to make that as public as we can, spread it in as many channels as we can, because that is, talking about sin, that is becoming one of the deep sins of our age, is greenwashing.
Thank you, Derrick. To tie it back to that earlier piece on collective action and what we can do proactively, where do you think we are in terms of kind of a movement moment aspect to this? If we think about some of the recent climate type movements, usually involves provoking a moral crisis, whether it's Greta Thunberg out front, it's whether it's the Sunrise Movement taking over Nancy Pelosi's office, whether it's people setting up encampments at Standing Rock, right? This moral crisis is provoked, but then at the same time, there's also this vision for moving forward, whether it's the Green New Deal or what have you. And it's just that vision piece, I'm curious to know your thoughts on, do you feel like in this moment right now, there is a compelling vision being put forth? You did point to some policy pieces. Is that the compelling vision, or is there something more overarching than that you put your finger on?
Boy, that's a really great question. So one of the things that I thought was really pretty fascinating was that several months after we had decided that Plastic Jesus was going to be our Earth Day resource this year, the International Earth Day organization decided that Planet versus Plastic was going to be their motto for Earth Day this year. And so there is something in the zeitgeist that is saying our plastic world is not working. And I think one of the places where we're beginning to see that moral outrage, and this is so often the case, right, is around children, is that there are numerous studies showing that nanoplastics and microplastics are being found in breast milk. And there was a study that was done recently that I believe it was a British study, where every woman in the study, every woman in the study gave birth. It was a study of pregnant women. Every woman in the study gave birth, and there was plastic found in the placentas. Every woman in the study, from a wide range of backgrounds. So we're beginning to understand that this is a health crisis that is getting to the most vulnerable of our populations. And sometimes, unfortunately, the pictures of animal suffering in nature is not enough of a moral cry. But when we feel it in ourselves and in the vulnerable within our own communities, that's where the moral outrage comes from. I think you, Brooks, you were the one, I think, who pointed us towards Rise St. James in Cancer Alley. And I don't know how anyone can look at Cancer Alley and not feel the moral outrage there, not feel the outrage of um, hundreds of facilities in an 85-mile stretch of land being built in communities, in low-income Black and Brown communities, and seeing the cancer rates, seeing the types and varieties of cancers, the types and varieties of skin issues and birth defects. That's a story that I think needs to be far more known and seen and talked about, because that is a story that, for me, that provokes outrage, and we need a little bit of outrage right now. We need a little bit of outrage. We need a little bit of that kind of righteous anger. That I think you're absolutely right. And I think there's also, what does our future look like? Again, the fact that plastics, their proliferation in our society has been less than 100 years. So we don't have to go back that far as a society to say we can live without plastics. And here's what it looked like. We can go back to having, fabric shopping bags. We can go back to saying that oranges have good enough coverings by themselves, that we don't need to put them in plastic containers. That we really don't need to have all of the plastic instruments that we have. Yes, there are good beneficial uses of plastics. There really are. There have been some really helpful uses of plastics in our culture, but the kind of ridiculous proliferation of single-use plastics, that's really what we want to talk about, and that's really what we have to have a vision for, is that in some ways we know what it can look like to not have these things in our society. We don't have to go back that far.
Thanks. Yeah, I really appreciate how you start out with the history, because as you're talking, it reminded me of something that Howard Zinn used to say years ago. When you know the history, you know that what's been done can be undone, right? It's not like some permanent, inevitable aspect of reality, and so it's ironic that we're in this position of having to, denaturalize plastic, which is like the most unnatural thing, right? So yeah, I really definitely appreciate that. And you've given us lots of gems of insight and wisdom today, Derrick. Unfortunately, our time is coming to an end. But I do want to point everybody to the free downloadable resource that is Plastic Jesus. It's a terrific resource for our congregations and for our churches. And so it's terrific to have it right in this moment when, as you said, it's, the world is talking about plastic and thinking about plastic and looking for solutions. And so it's very timely. And so we're grateful to you and your work, your ministry, and to Creation Justice Ministries as a whole. So thanks for everything that you've contributed. I know I'm going to go check out some of those videos. I'm really curious about the music for the song or hymn Plastic Jesus. I'll put that on my rotation. I'm excited about that. So thank you, Derrick.